Okay, as I can see now, we're getting a good amount of people now filling in terms of the attendees. So, further ado, I'm going to kickstart this webinar. Well, everyone, thanks very much for joining us today as we examine the Canadian Energy Outlook. My name is Matthew McIntosh. I will be representing the Canadian International Council's Toronto branch today. The Canadian International Council is Canada's leading independent, nonpartisan foreign affairs council, operating as a platform for citizens to engage in discussions on Canada and international affairs, though this current event today will be a little bit more domestically focused. The CIC has 16 branches across the country, with the Toronto branch being one of its largest. Typically, the CIC has town halls and debates, but with the onset of COVID-19, the council has frequently conducted Zoom webinars, the likes of which can also be found on our CIC YouTube page. And this webinar will also be able to be accessed on our CIC YouTube page after today. Today, we will consider the recent developments as well as the future of Canadian energy, the likes of which is not only a truly national discussion, but as part of an ongoing discussion across countries in the world in the attempts to devise effective energy policies. The plunge of global oil prices this year in 2020 has become just another issue to deal with amidst the spread of COVID-19, with Canada's chief oil blend of Western Canadian Select declining by 90.49% in terms of its monthly average price from $36.82 US per barrel in January to just $3.50 per barrel US, in April 2020. But that said, many Canadian oil companies have already announced cuts this year, as you'll begin to see throughout the webinar's proceedings. And essentially, yes, the Canadian oil industry has suffered. So, accordingly, the webinar has to raise the question of whether big oil is a thing of the past. As such, the webinar is planned to consist of 4 main panelists who will present on a topic in order to actually address this question. Our first panelist will actually begin the webinar's presentations with an in-depth, thorough review of how the Canadian energy landscape, especially that of oil, has been challenged this year. This will include insight into the predominant political responses to the oil price drop, in addition to alternative energy and renewable energy considerations. The panelist explaining all of this is an award-winning journalist with a demonstrated history in print, online, and broadcast. With a Bachelor of Journalism and a Bachelor of Business and Corporate Communications from Queensland University of Technology, she landed in Alberta as a provincial affairs reporter for the Edmonton Journal, where she hosts the weekly Press Gallery podcast about Alberta politics. Her most notable Canadian reporting positions include work for CTV, the Edmonton Journal, the CBC, and currently the Globe and Mail. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm of course referring to the Globe and Mail's energy reporter, Ms. Emma Graney. Thank you for joining us, Emma.
Hi, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure indeed. Thanks for joining us today. We're looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too.
So following Emma's rundown of the story of Canadian energy in 2020, the webinar will then explore the Canadian oil industry's continued significance amidst this year's oil price drop, explaining whether Canadian oil companies are diversifying their energy mix, whether there's still a strong financial interest in the oil industry here, and whether we can actually see a strong return to form, financially speaking, for the oil sector. In doing all of this, our second panelist is a highly experienced research expert in the Canadian oil and gas industry, possessing both an MA and a BA in economics from the University of Calgary. She is skilled in analyzing energy and environmental issues, whilst providing thorough economic impact analysis. Her current role as Vice President, Research at the Canadian Energy Research Institute makes her responsible for managing the Institute's research agenda, which includes selecting and leading research projects and assisting in the production of economic and environmental analysis, as well as economic modeling. I now warmly welcome the Vice President of Research of the Canadian Energy Research Institute, Ms. Dinara Millington.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Matthew.
My pleasure, Dinara.
Honored to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So following Dinara, the webinar will move to consider Canada's low carbon and energy future by examining the significance of clean energy and as well as how the oil industry can evolve. The panelist presenting this is a consultant and energy affairs expert with a BA in political science from Trent University. He has a strong background in politics, public policy, and has worked as a policy advisor at Clean Energy Canada. In fact, in energy, he has worked predominantly on transportation, fuels, and electricity policy. He's also worked as a public affairs consultant, advising clients in the nuclear, renewable, conventional, and biofuel energy sectors. The CIC welcomes today's third panelist, a consultant with Global Public Affairs, Energy, Environment, and Resources team, Mr. Fernando Melo.
Hi, Matthew. Thank you very much for having us. Looking forward to a really lively discussion.
Likewise, Fernando. Thanks very much for joining us today. So once Fernando has finished presenting attendees, the webinar will actually allow Fernando and Dinara to each discuss and debate ideas with one another for about 8 minutes. Each person can ask 2 particular questions and must answer 2 as well. So each question will allow a response or rebuttal of roughly about a minute to a minute and a half or so. So buckle up for this section, folks, because this will be a lot of fun. Once that debate session is concluded, the webinar will actually examine the political considerations in dealing with Canada's energy issues moving forward. This will, of course, include insight into federal as well as provincial issues, especially concerning Alberta, and also how the 2 possible outcomes of next week's US presidential election will influence the Canadian energy landscape, as well as Canadian and US relations, Canadian and American energy relations as a whole. The panelist tasked with this assignment is a former Ontario cabinet minister who is now Clearwater Fine Food Incorporated's Vice President of Corporate Affairs as of 2018. With a BA in Business and Political Science from the University of Toronto, this panelist had a highly successful 30 years in politics. He first served as a Toronto City Councillor for Scarborough for 9 years from 1994 to 2003, after which he went on to serve 15 years at Queen's Park as a long-serving Liberal member of the Legislative Assembly of Ontario from 2003 to 2018, whilst representing the riding of Scarborough Centre. And while he had many ministerial positions during his time at Queen's Park, crucial to this webinar, he was Ontario's Minister of Energy and Infrastructure from 2010 to 2011. The CICTO is pleased to welcome the former Honourable Ontario Minister of Energy and Infrastructure, Mr. Brad Duguid.
Oh, thank you, Matthew. I'm glad to be your token politician on the panel today and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much for joining us, Brad. Looking forward to this. Once Brad is finished speaking, everyone, we're actually going to have a Q&A session. And this was an opportunity for you all as attendees to ask questions in the Q&A toolbar at the bottom of Zoom. This is a great function because it's going to allow attendees to comment on one another's questions as well in terms of liking as well. And it provides a sense of which questions are really the juiciest to consider. Okay, folks, with that said, I'm now going to give the screen to Miss Emma Graney. And looking forward to this, Emma. Screen is yours.
Thanks very much, Matt. Lovely to be here, everybody. Let me share my screen with you because I have an exciting PowerPoint presentation, potentially. I hope you find it exciting. I had a lot of fun. So here we are. I'm going to be talking to you guys about oil in 2020. Spoiler alert, it has been a wild ride, thanks to COVID for the most part. I think good old COVID has impacted all of our lives in some kind of way this year. So first of all, let's start right on in with decimated oil prices. Now, I've got a couple of charts here. So we've got West Texas International, which is the top one. That's kind of like your standard benchmark, one of the international benchmarks anyway. As you can see, year over year, we had a 30% drop. That's pretty massive. And then the average price down 33% as well. When it comes to Western Canadian Select, which is of course what we get up here, although governments and also industry tend to stick with WTI when they're looking at their forecasts and that kind of thing. But there's been a massive fall there as well, 36.6% year on year. And then the average has fallen 45.7%. You know what? Hasn't been a great time for oil for the last few years. 2020 has been absolutely worse than anyone expected. Let's talk a little bit about what happened in April. Now, this day was absolutely bonkers. So it was April 2020. Basically, WTI prices hit a low they've never, ever, ever hit before. So we had demand was completely tanking because COVID, everyone was staying home, no one's flying anywhere. We had storage was kind of sloshing up. You had crude sloshing up around the tops of tanks. You may have seen images of like these tankers off the coast of the United States just storing oil because there was literally nowhere else to put it. Then we had a Saudi-Russia price war on top of that, where they were both like, no, we're going to keep things low. We're going to keep things low. And there was demand. It was just an absolute crapshoot. So altogether, let's call it a perfect storm. As you can see in that giant red arrow, we hit negative 37.63, which is completely bonkers. I think it, for one moment, actually slipped down to 40. So that was a massive hit for the oil industry. Why that happened? Now, there's a great article, if you can go check it out. It's called Inside the Biggest Oil Meltdown in History on Institutional Investor. It was a great read, talked to a lot of analysts about what happened. But basically, the pandemic had decimated demand. There was a glut of crude, storage was full, and there's these weird things called futures contracts where investors kind of agree to pay a certain price for oil the next month and they resell it at a profit. But because the pandemic had crippled demand, there's no market for the oil contracts. So it created this kind of bizarre reality where investors would have to kind of like pay buyers to take the crude off of their hands. And you just imagine like a whole bunch of oil, rocking up at Goldman Sachs or something. Obviously wasn't going to happen. So it was just a completely bonkers day. We have kind of had a recovery. I'm going to hedge that because as you can see, I think that's a fair term there. But you can see here when it comes to that graph, it's got the big deep dip there. That was like, $40 below zero. And now we've kind of up around the $30 mark. And this will all depend though on what happens with the second wave and what happens with the economic recovery. That is what's going to look into the future here. Now, the economic impact, as you might expect, has been absolutely massive. Here in Alberta, I'm based in Calgary. So as you're all probably aware, oil does play a large part of our economy here in Alberta. So in February, I would say with the latest financial kind of forecast from Alberta, they're looking at a $24.2 billion, that's with a B, dollar deficit, which is about $16.8 billion higher than projected in February. I remember in February actually being at the budget day, and people were asking Finance Minister Travis Taves, like, hey, this COVID thing, at that point, remember, that was not really in Canada so much. Like, what do you reckon is going to happen? Is it going to impact? And his answer was, well, we have to see. No one's really sure. And he was right. No one was really sure what was going to happen. And what happened was very, very bad. Canada, of course, will be hit by this as well. Statistics Canada has put forward 3 different economic impact scenarios. As you can see on the screen there are a lot of different things to take into account. Definitely go and have a read of their forecasting and their article on this. It's really interesting, but as you can see, thousands and thousands of job losses and a GDP hit between 1% and 2%. The fallout has been interesting. So, in Alberta, the government here, the United Conservative government, has certainly really started pursuing this notion of diversification. Now, that wasn't a massive part of their election platform, but they seem to have just been like, you know what, we need to do everything that we can to try and make sure that Alberta can somehow come out of this absolutely dire straits that we're in right now. They've got a lot of infrastructure programs. They've emptied the TIER fund, which is basically the fund that it's all the money from the carbon tax on large emitters goes into that fund. So it's been put out to a bunch of different projects. Federally, there were programs through EDC and BDC. There was not a lot of uptake of those with the oil industry. That's because they didn't really like the terms and conditions and it wasn't really going to help them. However, a lot of oil companies did take up the government on the federal wage subsidies. It really did help a lot of companies there. One of the most interesting things was kind of joint provincial federal program funded by the federal government, which is funding inactive well cleanup. You may have seen an article in the New York Times this morning about inactive wells and how much of a problem it is. We've done a lot of stories on this. It is a massive, huge thing, but now you've got money coming in. Unemployed oil workers can kind of pivot and go to the cleanup stage, which will help the environment, it helps with jobs, and it helps with the economy. So it's really a triple win. When it comes to industry, though, the big word now is consolidation. I mean, small companies aren't getting credit that they need to keep running. There's this idea of, large players are like, oh, there's a bargain there, let's grab it. So, for example, you would have seen the news about the Cenovus Husky merger, which was announced on Sunday. Lots of companies are buying different things or trying. Tourmaline for example, has bought a lot of natural gas assets. I have other examples there. One of my favorites was Wilkes Brothers out of Texas were trying to launch a hostile takeover of Calfrac, which is a service company. It didn't really work out for them, but it was a real saga to follow that. But the message out of the oil industry is all about belt tightening, right? So a lot of them have cut their capital expenditures to try and deal with it. They were doing that back in March. It's just become even more so now. But a lot of that then has followed through to job losses. And again, CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, estimates about 28,000 jobs have already been lost in oil production in 2020. It's a massive number. So let's move to green transitions, which is, I know, going to be a big part of this discussion on the panel today. Obviously, emotions have not fallen. Emissions have fallen. If anything, emotions are riding high. But with recovery, there's a good chance those emissions will actually increase again. That's what we've seen in China, which of course entered into COVID earlier than the rest of the world. As their economy recovers, emissions are also growing. Now, the International Energy Agency has really kind of taken aim at this and said, you know what, like, governments are going to have to put money towards recovery. Let's take this once in a lifetime chance, a pandemic, and actually kind of speed up green transitions, invest in things that can help us move towards a greener economy. And that seems to have spurred a kind of greater appetite for thinking outside the box, you know. So it seems like most governments and different industries as well are popping up. And here in Canada, and particularly with Alberta, there's been this kind of interesting meeting of the minds that doesn't necessarily happen all the time when you, have a Liberal government in Ottawa and we're out here in Alberta. But they really are both looking at alternative energy forms. They're looking at hydrogen, they're looking at geothermal, and they're looking at small modular nuclear reactors. So it's been a really interesting time. And I guess we're going to see where things go from here. And I'll stop sharing my screen. So yeah, we're going to see what happens from here. I think it's going to be interesting to see where we end up. And of course, where the transitions go, because there's certainly an appetite for it.
Excellent stuff. Thank you very much, Emma. That is a very, very thorough rundown of the story of energy in Canada in 2020. With that said, folks, we now want to actually examine how the oil industry, as much as what Emma was saying, has actually responded to what has currently happened this year, and for some insights into the future of Canadian oil. So I will now give the floor to Ms. Dinara Millington. Dinara, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you, everyone. And I'm just gonna do my screen share over here. All right, thank you very much. So picking up where I guess Emma left off, and thank you for providing such a great lay of land in terms of where we are at with the ongoing pandemic. The main question I'm going to try to answer here in my 7 to 10 minute presentation is whether the success of the Canadian oil industry is a thing of the past, or do we have things to look forward to? Just before I go on, a quick shameless promotion for the organization I work for. CIRI has been around for 45 years, in fact, our 45th birthday this year. And we specialize in energy economics and related environmental policy issues when it comes to Canadian energy production, transportation, and consumption. So in this afternoon's presentation, I will try to answer some of these questions. And if I don't get to all of them, please feel free to write me a question, and hopefully we'll get to all of these by the end of the panel. Well, if I could only use one image in my presentation, this would be it. Over the last 20 years, about 2.5 billion people around the world have been lifted out of poverty. Over the next 20 years, we're expecting to lift another 1 to 2 billion out of poverty. And the global population, however, is not at a standstill. We're still expecting the global population to increase by additional 1 to 2 billion people. What this graphic shows is that how humanity is grouped by various income levels. and how the world looks for them. The graphic there at the bottom shows how many people in the world live in each category. The fascinating thing that you sort of want to pick up here is if we want to move people from level 2 that earn about $2 to $8 a day to level 3, their primary energy demand goes up by a factor of 10. When you want to move from level 3 to level 4, it goes by an additional factor of 10. So people like us that live in Canada and people in the rest of the sort of developed Western world are using about 100 times as much energy as someone living under level 2. And as we move forward over the next 20 years, we expect billions of people to be stepping out from this energy poverty into the next tier. So I would venture out to say that the global energy demand is going to continue to grow for foreseeable future at significant levels. The question, however, obviously becomes, how do we decarbonize this energy demand? This is a whole other conversation probably for another panel. But if we quickly look at some of the aggressive decarbonization scenarios produced by agencies such as UN or the International Energy Agency, we're still seeing that over the next 10 to 15 years, the overall primary energy demand continue to grow, with some of the energy such as coal will continue to decline. However, we're seeing a significant uptick in natural gas as it considered a sort of a bridge fuel from a large hydrocarbon energy component to less so. And oil demand in particular, we're seeing some growth within the next sort of decade and flattening out by early to mid 2030s. So the notion that oil is dead, it really has no data behind that, and it's not based on science. So where does Canada fit in? So we as a country already have one of the highest environmental standards on the planet, along with highest human rights, labor, and Indigenous consultation standards. So if the world does not use Canadian oil, that gap will be captured by countries where the crude is coming from, places like Nigeria, Russia, Middle East. And all of these countries do not have their own domestic regulatory policies that address climate change, and they're not signatories to Paris Accord like Canada is. And so the theory there would be that the direct impact of that would be increase in overall greenhouse gas emissions. So switching to what our primary energy demand is going to look like globally, the International Energy Agency is not expecting the primary energy demand to recover to pre-COVID levels before 2023. And these trends will also, the trend of recovery and the speed of recovery will depend on various countries. So for example, energy use in advanced economies will increase slightly after the crisis, but it will not return to pre-pandemic levels. Whereas the energy demand will rebound significantly in places such as the Asian continent, where we have seen some early success in bringing the pandemic under the control, and where we've seen a rebound in the energy demand. The negative impacts on countries that have the lowest incomes around the world, these are probably be the most adversely impacted because the governments have less cushion to absorb the blows of the pandemic. And the access to energy and electricity are being delayed. So what you see here in the graph that we are seeing on the oil side, which is the blue line there, is that the era of the growth in global energy and in the global oil demand will come to an end sometime by early 2030s. In both scenarios for EIA, they're suggesting that oil demand will flatten out. However, there are a couple of factors in the sort of short to medium term where we're still playing with some of the uncertain ranges of where oil demand will end up. However, in the absence of aggressive government policies, it is still too early to see a significant rapid decline in oil demand. Is driven by the countries in developing world, in Asian continent, that will continue seeking energy sources to increase their economic standard of living. The one nuance that you should be aware of is that while road transportation was the largest component overall oil demand in the past, going forward is going to be petrochemicals, petrochemicals that are used in the production of our final end goods and plastic and so on. So as was already mentioned, the global oil industry is experiencing a shock like no other in the history. In fact, the energy demand contraction that we witnessed in the early 2020 is 7 times larger than what was witnessed during the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. This impact will be felt throughout the full global supply chain for crude oil industry and ripple into other parts of energy sector and in the economy. As a result, as you see here on your chart, oil companies around the world have responded to the price collapse that we saw as a result of the pandemic by announcing significant cuts to their capital expenditure programs for the new production. The initial reduction there you see are in a range of 20 to 35% compared to the investments that were announced for 2020 before the pandemic had started. However, the scope for further cost reduction in the overall production process of crude oil is much more limited today than what we saw when the price collapsed in mid-2014. Because, and as a result, much of these efficiency gains have already been captured and harvested. So as a result, the current decline in capital investment is directly translated into cutting back the activity. Some producers did manage to hedge their 2020 output for higher prices. However, it is not a long-term solution. It's more of a short-term band-aid. All of this brings renewed hardship to companies that provide services to E&P companies, for example. And we saw that in the Canadian oil and gas service sector, where we saw significant employment contraction for the service sector. So bringing it closer to home, the Canadian oil industry has experienced a significant decline in capital investment as well. We saw an overall annualized 32% decrease between 2019 and 2020. Even prior to pandemic, the low energy prices, policy uncertainty, market access issues that we saw coming out of Western Canada and lack of export pipeline capacity have all sort of continued to weigh in on the drilling programs for new wells and the large-scale oil sands bitumen projects. Instead of developing new greenfield projects, what the companies in Canada have sort of pivoted to focus more of their capital in the sustaining of their existing assets by increasing the production capacity. The 32% decline in overall capital investment breaks down to about 57% decline on the conventional oil and gas side and about 2% on the oil sand side on a year to year. So however, though, even prior to pandemic, in 2019, with all the different challenges that the industry has faced, we still saw an increase in the overall annual production for the Canadian crude and liquids. And we saw a significant increase in exports of Canadian crude to the United States, our number one buyer. About 98% of Canadian crude exports are directed towards the US. The US Midwest and Gulf of Mexico markets continue to be the most favorable markets for Canadian, especially heavy bitumen and dilbit production, because those refineries in those two jurisdictions are are designed to handle heavy output, as domestic indigenous production in the United States is predominantly coming from shale oil in the form of light sweet crude oil. This is just quickly in terms of where we see Canadian oil industry going. This is our institute's long-term production forecast. And you see in the immediate years between now until about 2023, there's a high range of uncertainty where the production will end up. We're forecasting as little as 170,000 barrels per day would be cut to as more as 1 million barrels per day. However, going to medium to long term, we're expecting that the prices will increase, and that would kick in some of the new capital expenditure programs, and the production will continue to increase. However, this is very dependent on how successful the industry is at capturing additional capital investment against the background of increased importance of the environmental, social, and governance factors, as well as the competition on the global scale among all the different producers around the world. And just a little snapshot of where we see the oil sands going, oil sands production growing. Again, in the immediate term, we see a quite large variation in terms of where we going to see production cut. We're expecting a larger decrease on the in situ side of oil sands production rather than in mining. But overall, in long term, we're seeing a production continue to increase. So with that said, and some of these programs Emma mentioned, I mean, the industry is definitely in a unprecedented situation environment where, you know, the capital investment is not necessarily available to them immediately to continue increase their production. And hence some of the programs, stimulus packages that we saw coming out of federal and provincial governments are aimed at minimizing some of that adverse impact. However, going forward, again, these different stimulus packages are not panacea for Canadian oil and gas industries and oil sands industry in particular. The industry needs to continue to innovate, to continue to decrease their cost of production, and to improve their environmental footprint. And so just to sort of conclude, I just want to point out that the Canadian oil industry, and specifically the oil sands industry, is an innovator. Over the last few decades, as oil sands production became commercial production, we saw significant investment and significant improvements in the technology that are used to extract, in this particular chart, oil sands bitumen. The next wave of technologies, as was mentioned on the previous slide, we need to look beyond just extracting bitumen. We need to think of value-add products that we could be created from bitumen. So programs like bitumen beyond combustion. We needed to look into hydrogen and even usage of small nuclear reactors, small modular reactors to provide energy for some of these in situ projects that would require a lot of energy to extract the bitumen. So just in the conclusion, I just want to say, you know, the sort of back to my questions originally on my agenda slide, whether, you know, whether the companies, whether there is a longevity to the oil sands and Canadian oil industry, and my answer is simply yes. However, there are challenges that need to be overcome, and we can no longer be, the industry can no longer be satisfied with the status quo. We need to move beyond what we were doing before and what has worked before. Thank you, and looking forward to the rest of the panelists.
Well, Dinara, thanks very much for providing that thorough rundown of how the Canadian oil industry has responded and how oil is continuing to move forward as an industry in the future. With that said, there's also much to consider when it comes to clean energy, as clean energy has become very much a component of, I would say, much of the response in terms of what's happened this year, in terms of the overall discussion. But as we begin to see, as Fernando will explain, clean energy and oil can evolve together in tandem. So Fernando, by all means, the floor, or excuse me, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
My pleasure.
All right, so hopefully we'll be able to run this through just fine here. All right. All right, can everyone see my screen here? There.
Not yet, Fernando. Oh, there we are.
Okay. All right, so I'm gonna try to be the resident optimist of the panel here, and I'm gonna answer the question right off the top. Yes, big oil companies will still exist in 2050 and beyond, but selling fossil fuels for combustion, as Dinara said, probably won't be the main source of their profits. Their future and Canada's economic future is reliant on getting to net zero and being amongst the first to do it. And there is a necessity to act now, not just because of climate change, but about trying to be first mover in that market. And yes, we're in a time of crisis, but times of crisis are when we need to be bold and reimagine where we're going. So a little bit of a basis. The vast majority of Canadians want to see their governments prioritize climate change in the economic recovery from COVID-19. And the GTA, which is where a significant part of Canadians live, no one, even conservatives, want to see a government take on anything without a major climate plan. And many of the major federal parties, as well as our provinces, are really digging in to deal with it. And now it's not just me who sort of wants to really take it on in terms of a climate change problem. It's our major capital markets and institutional investors. So there's over $11 trillion in assets under management that have committed to divesting from fossil fuels. That's a large problem for our oil and gas industry. And even institutional investors like the Canadian Pension Plan, which has recently come under fire for being invested in oil and gas, is starting to diversify its portfolio, making significant investments in clean tech companies like ChargePoint, which is the world's largest electric vehicle charging company. Then you also have companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, which have really invested heavily in going green. But you also have companies like IKEA, which is committed to going carbon negative, meaning their entire supply chain and operations will actually reduce more carbon from the atmosphere and take it in and sequester it than they will produce over the long term. Now, at least in terms of capital markets, Canada has a sort of roadmap to go down. Last year, the federal government commissioned a study called the Sustainable Finance Report, which our now Bank of Canada chair was one of the co-authors of. And it really looked at how the private sector capital can be really galvanized to advance this clean transition. And it's a good thing that we have that plan going, because the recent International Energy Agency report showed that if we do nothing and just lead our power, our heavy industry, and our other conventional industry, we're going to hit 1.65 degrees of warming, which the International Panel on Climate Change says is pretty bad for all human civilization as we know it. But investments in clean energy are actually a pretty solid way forward. As you can see, McKinsey estimates that investments in renewable energy is a serious employer and moneymaker. Now, according to Clean Energy Canada, before the pandemic, Canada's clean energy industry employed 300,000 people and contributed $60 billion to Canada's GDP. And Canada's home to some real leaders in the world of clean tech, where we have two of the biggest companies in the hydrogen industry with Ballard and Hydrogenics. We've got innovative electric vehicle companies like Lion Electric and New Flyer. Yes, the bus company. And then we've got companies like Ecobee, which makes smart thermostats, and Illumisoft, which makes the world's most energy efficient lighting fixtures. Now, they're all contributing to Canada's overall GDP, with ISED estimating that in 2017, Canada's clean energy exports were worth $7.8 billion. And overall, there's a huge prize to be made in investments in clean technology and renewables. Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimates that between now and 2050, there will be $15.1 trillion added in new electricity capacity. The vast majority of that actually coming from low-cost renewables like solar and wind. Canada can really help this transition and investment in that, as we supply world-class leading technology and the minerals that go into building a lot of this new renewable capacity. We actually are home to 14 of the 18 minerals used in solar photovoltaic panels at commercial quantities. So not just, little trace amounts, but we actually have the potential to mine at significant amounts and create them all with low carbon electricity from a already very clean grid. We have not just the ability to produce the mines, the minerals, and the items in it, we have the ability to manage the grid, and we have some great companies producing the grid management software. And we also have the expertise. We have independent power producers like Intergex, which are helping countries like Chile develop their renewable electricity capacity. And companies like them in Brookfield will have a great deal of opportunity to help develop these renewables around the world based on their expertise here in Canada. And it's not just limited to electricity production. The International Energy Agency predicts that by 2030, there will be 150 to 250 new plug-in electric vehicles on the market, increasing the demand for the minerals and the parts that go into electric vehicles. And Canada actually just got two major investments in the electric vehicle space, with Ford and Fiat Chrysler both committing billions to producing electric vehicles here in Canada. But in my opinion, one of the most exciting parts of it is our companies like Magna and Linamar, who are the two of the largest auto parts manufacturers. And that's where Canada can really dig in. And they've committed to going full force on electric vehicles. And overall, innovation, science, and economic development sees the global clean tech market, so electric vehicles, all those supplies and all those great things I just talked about, exceeding $2.5 trillion in value by 2022. That's a significant amount, even with the current demand slump brought on by COVID. And all of this isn't happening in a vacuum. Over 60 countries have pledged to go carbon neutral. This includes most of the G20, and if Biden's elected next month, that will add the US. This month alone, 3 major market economies have been added to it. China has pledged to go to carbon neutral before 2060. And on Wednesday, Japan and South Korea both committed to that. We have the entirety of the EU committed to carbon neutrality. And we're seeing China as a major player in this. China is the reason that the IEA just recently called solar the king of energy, because they invested heavily in that. And just the size of its market and the command nature of its economy has really been able to help scale a lot of renewables. And that investment is quite key, especially as we see the development of electric vehicles, which will be important as more and more countries phase out internal combustion engines. I mean, Austria has committed that after this year, they will not allow the sale of an internal combustion engine new internal combustion engine vehicle. And then we have countries like the UK and France and jurisdictions like California, which are phasing out the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles by between 2030 and 2040. And Canada's got a goal of getting to 100% electric vehicle sales or zero emission vehicle sales by about that time. And lastly, we're also seeing a shift away from coal and even natural gas in a lot of our electric markets. Now, the International Energy Agency sees a demand for gas, and so does Bloomberg, continuing forward, but at a diminished role often in capacity to use what's called peaking. So it's not just, we have countries really seeing this market, and they're really betting their economic recovery on renewables, and clean technology. All told, McKinsey estimates that world governments have pledged $10 trillion into low carbon stimulus spending for their country's overall economic recovery. And in Canada, we're not exactly falling behind on that. While most of the pledges made by the federal government are previously committed to, either in their last mandate or early on in their 2019 mandate, much of the money that has been behind them has really been amped up. And a lot of these initiatives, including accelerated capital cost allowance, will help companies adopt clean tech solutions. So ultimately, where's oil and gas in all of this? Everywhere. One of the most, oil and gas is a feedstock for carbon fiber for lightweight car parts. And that's actually one of the most cost-effective ways that auto manufacturers can improve the emissions efficiency of their vehicles, is by losing weight. Oil and gas, there's a lot of ongoing projects that is going to extract lithium from the Leduc Formation, which is a major oil formation in Alberta, as well as from oil sands brine. Oil and gas can be used to make low carbon ammonia and hydrogen. And ammonia can be used to store power or improve the combustion of coal-fired plants by as much as 20 to 30% just by adding it to it, allowing them to lower emissions, increase efficiency before ultimately being phased out. And one of the main things is Canada actually produces a lot of hydrogen already by a process called steam methane reforming. So we transform our natural gas through a fun chemical process, split into hydrogen and carbon. Right now, we're venting a lot of that carbon into the atmosphere, but through the application of carbon capture, use, and storage, we can actually lower that CI and become incredibly efficient in it. So a little bit more on hydrogen. Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimates that over a third of all energy emissions can be abated by the use of hydrogen. And that by 2050, $700 billion will be spent on hydrogen alone. And that's not to mention the equipment and the services associated with it. Sweden itself right now is actually making serious investments in commercializing a technology that would eliminate the use of coking coal in steel production, and through the use of zero emissions hydrogen, which will greatly reduce that overall emissions profile. And then we also have it seen in power grids, with actually in Scarborough, a partnership between Enbridge and Hydrogenics to take excess power from renewables, turn that into gas, which will then return back into electricity when the electricity grid needs it. And as you can see here, the Transition Accelerator, which is a great organization based out of University of Calgary, has found that Canada's natural gas, when applied with carbon capture and storage, is one of the lowest cost and lowest emissions in terms of profile in the world. So Canada has a serious opportunity to make a dent and gain access to a lot of that burgeoning market for hydrogen, especially as economies like Japan start to look at that as a major source of energy in their coming future. So how do we unlock all this potential? Because as Dinara said, a lot of these energy companies are cash strapped. Well, the government of Canada just invested $100 million in the Clean Resource Innovation Network to help sort of create emissions reductions and innovations throughout the oil and gas sector. But it also requires policies like the Clean Fuel Standard that drive investment into these lower emissions fuels and process improvements, and make a lot of these lower emissions chemicals and fuels a lot more cost competitive. But it's also going to take leadership and support from all levels of government to really make these sort of innovations happen. And really looking forward to getting into further discussions on this one with Dinara. Thanks for your time.
Excellent, Fernando. Thank you very much. Dinara, we're now asking you to turn on your video as we begin the debate sequence. Unfortunately, to both Dinara and Fernando, and as well as you all attendees, I'm going to try and limit the debate time a little bit now, just because we're a little bit short on time. So for the purposes of the debate for now, we'll do one question each from both Dinara and Fernando, and an answer each as well. And then we will then move forward to Brad speaking with his portion. But if we do have time, we'll return to any potential other debate questions with Dinara and Fernando during the Q&A section. So I will allow ladies first. Dinara, please ask your question for Fernando.
Ooh. Great. Thank you so much, Fernando. I found your presentation really informative. I guess the one thing that I want to ask you about sort of the idea of moving to the net zero society, whether that's in Canada or globally, but then at the same token, how do you reconcile the affordability question of energy services? And back to my original picture when I showed, you know, the world population growing and a lot of people still don't have access to basic energy services, and the implication that if they were to move into clean energy or green energy, that the affordability aspect might be lost. Like, can you comment on that?
So that is a really big question, especially where we're looking at what we're trying to avoid, which is technology lock-in. So a lot of areas, especially if we'll look at energy poor areas like sub-Saharan Africa. Canada, in a lot of the more affluent areas, we've already got some technology lock-in. But in places like sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of really interesting experiments going on with microgrids. So replacing use of biofuels, so wood for cooking and heat and energy, with low-cost solar or wind microgrids, and seeing investment in that. So because these are so low cost in terms of overall levelized cost, we're able to sort of move towards electric cooking and heating and things like that, and create that sort of technology avoidance of lock-in. So we're not building large-scale pipeline networks and things like that. We're able to deploy smaller renewables at lower costs in those areas. Now, if we're transitioning to areas where we're not sort of starting from scratch almost, it's a lot more difficult. And that transition, we're going to need to see a lot of government support, even though government is strapped, and start to see, especially for deep energy retrofits and transition on that. And that's where hydrogen is actually going to be a great technology to sort of try and keep things affordable, because it can hijack a lot of conventional infrastructure. Most places have pipelines running to them, and we can do with minimal retrofit, add 15% of hydrogen to lower that.
Indeed.
And then,
oh, excuse me, Fernando, I do have to apologize, but we are a little bit short on time, and I probably should have given you a bit more of a 45-second time frame. But Fernando, I'm not going to have to ask you to ask your question. Dinara, I think that was a very, very thorough and detailed answer, and we can always return to the discussion later on in the Q&A section. But Fernando, please ask your question now to Dinara.
So Canada's facing off with a heavy competition on the international stage for energy. Do you see markets like the EU paying a premium for lower carbon intensity oil and gas products, even for feedstocks on things like plastics?
So I think where the European Union is moving towards is the idea of the border carbon adjustment tax. And I think this is an area that Canada should really be exploring, because if we are competing, and we are, you know, our producers of energy and energy suppliers are competing on the global stage for market share in various markets. And if the European market is one of those markets we were trying to get to, whether that's refined petroleum products or LNG or any other form of even final end use good products like plastic, I think that's where Canada could have an advantage over a country like US, for example, because internally within the country, we are looking at you know, addressing the greenhouse gas emissions and putting in regulations that would further enhance the or minimize the environmental footprint. And so if we are still, you know, if we're the country as a net exporter of products, then I think we will be at an advantage to export our products to countries like European Union against countries that would have to pay this border adjustment tax based on their dirtier processes, so to say, internally and producing their products.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dinara. Because there's plenty to consider, especially with Canadian-EU relations. But on that note, it's actually a very good segue in terms of the political things that we all need to consider now amidst this current discussion. I'm now going to call into the frame Mr. Brad Duguid in order to present upon the political considerations that need to occur over the next little while in terms of how Canadian energy can move forward. Brad, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew. And it's a pleasure to join you today. Thank you so much for putting this on. I knew Matthew many years ago. And if you think that he's got lots of energy on the screen here today, you should have seen him on the hockey rink. He and my son Kennedy played hockey together back when they were young. And boy, did he have a lot of energy then. And I can see that he still has that hyperactive energy now. I want to start off by answering the first question directly. And I know that's unusual for, or at least people would suggest that's unusual for politicians or ex-politicians. I want to answer the question, is big oil a thing of the past? And I think all the panelists have probably answered that already. And if in case anyone's wondering, the answer to that, in my opinion, is an emphatic no. The industry is in transition. The industry will be called upon to transition through significant technology disruption, and it's going through that now. The industry has some challenges here in Canada that we'll all need to work together to overcome. A lot of that, I expect, has already been outlined by my fellow panelists. But I want to be emphatic when I say the oil and gas industry in Canada remains crucial to our collective economic well-being. It has a future that I believe will be prosperous again. Will it ever return to the days of high oil and gas prices and insatiable demand? Probably not. But it still will have a really good run ahead of us, provided that we can overcome some of those challenges. And of course, provided that the price of oil eventually gets back up to a profitable level. Obviously, the global price of oil is crucial to attracting and the investment needed to enhance extraction production. And I think we all know that. I think if you look at the price of oil, it's something that's really controlled by global forces. So I'd rather focus on the things that are in our control in Canada to ensure that we continue to have a strong future for our oil and gas sector. And here are 4 areas of focus that I think are important. There are probably many others. The first is enhancing competitiveness. This is absolutely crucial. We need to be able to compete on that global stage. And a lot of that work's being done. I think this is very achievable. The second is infrastructure. And when we talk about infrastructure, it's really getting the product to market. Pipelines are the key to doing this. And for the most part, pipelines are proceeding slowly, yes, sometimes not surely, but they are proceeding nonetheless. The third area is one that's often ignored and one that I think is absolutely crucial. And that's including Indigenous communities in decision-making and creating true Indigenous industry government partnerships. This industry will not succeed without Indigenous involvement. In fact, most industries in Canada won't succeed without Indigenous involvement, without Indigenous partnership. And I would go so far as to say that we've moved beyond that now into a lot of situations where that partnership involves ownership. So in my view, this is either a game changer or a game stopper, and we could probably dedicate an entire other webinar to those issues. The fourth area that's crucial is continued government support for the technology innovation involved in the R&D to help scale our tech companies here in Canada. This is a great economic opportunity, as some of the other panelists have alluded to, but it's absolutely critical to get our oil and gas industry to the level that we need to get it at to be competitive. More importantly, it also gives Canada a global leader opportunity in environmental technology. That's going to create jobs here. and it's going to ensure that, that this industry has a very long and sustainable future ahead of us. And I think we have the ability here to not only meet the bar, but set the bar. And that's something that I think Canadians can embrace. I was asked to specifically address the political considerations and challenges in dealing with these issues moving forward. And I want to start by cutting through what I believe are years of political rhetoric and baggage from past energy eras. The political support for oil is as strong today across Canada as it ever has been. Obviously, the government of Alberta is the strongest champion, and they ought to be. And politically, it kind of makes sense, and always has, for the Premier of Alberta to paint themselves as the champions, and they are the champions of the oil and gas sector, and for the oil sands, while painting Ottawa as the villain or the bad guy. That might be good political maneuvering, but it just doesn't jive in today's reality. My experience suggests that the government of Canada truly understands that the oil and gas sector's success is critically important to their success and the success of our economy. And I believe our government knows that the oil and gas sector provides well over $100 billion to Canada's GDP. They care about the 530,000 direct and indirect jobs that are directly related and supported by this sector. They also understand that this is not all about Alberta's interest. And I want to sort of do a bit of an aside here and tell a little story when I was Minister of Economic Development in Ontario. At the time, Alberta and Ontario were going through a bit of a spat on the importance of the oil sands. You know, politically, it kind of makes sense for premiers and governments outside of the oil producing provinces to side with the anti-oil and gas advocates. I think in some cases, they think that they may have nothing to lose. And as we were contemplating our approach, I was approached by a number of Ontario business executives, and to be frank, they kind of read me the riot act and told me how crucial the oil sands are, not just to Alberta, but to Ontario businesses and to Canadian businesses and to our overall GDP. And I soon became a believer. I think our government did too. We changed our approach, and instead we reached out to enhance our economic and innovative partnerships with Alberta. Fortunately, I'd say few Canadians outside of the oil producing provinces really understand how important this sector is to their own provincial interests and their own provincial economies. And the fact is that Alberta's oil sand companies spend over $3.2 billion outside of Alberta across Canada, and Ontario, it was $1.9 billion alone. It's estimated that 2,000 companies outside of Alberta are doing business in the oil sands. About 1,100 of those come from Ontario. So no question, the Alberta oil sands and the oil and gas sector are crucial to the economic prosperity of all Canadians. So feelings about Western alienation aside, the government of Canada is and continues to be a significant champion of the oil and gas sector, as they should be. And yes, they have to walk a bit of a balance on the environmental side. And that's probably a good thing too. And yes, the oil sands may not be what they lead with when they're communicating their industrial strategy, but the fact is they're very much in the game. And my fellow panelists have outlined some of the involvement that they've had, but the feds are significantly investing in R&D and the innovative companies in the oil and gas sector that the sector is going to need to be more competitive and to be that global environmental leader. And I think it shouldn't be lost on anyone that they bought a pipeline. I mean, who does that unless they're serious about the need to get that product to market? So I just want to say, despite the political rhetoric, I see no reason for anything but alignment between what are arguably strange political bedfellows, government of Alberta and the government of Canada. And I also think that the government of Canada has been strategically smart in the way that they're directing resources to the oil and gas sector. Rather than just chucking money at it, they're investing strategically to drive the innovation needed in the sector to make the industry cleaner and more sustainable. And yesterday's announcement of the $750 million fund for oil and gas companies to reduce methane emissions is yet another example of that. The fact is, reducing carbon emissions will be crucial to the future of this industry. Finally, I I want to talk a little bit about the US election. But before I say that, I would say there's one area that I think there's still room for improvement. And that's, my fellow panelists have talked about that. That's this area of transition. And we don't know how long that's going to be. I believe there are huge opportunities in that area for Canadian technology to help drive some of the opportunities over that period of time, whether it's 10 years or 30 years. We're going to need technologies that's going to help us through that transition. And there's companies that I've had the honor of working with, like Valent out of Ontario. Actually, their interests are right across the country, that have 5 or 6 leading technologies that will help ensure that that transition can proceed smoothly. Now, finally, I was asked to say a few words about the potential impacts of the upcoming US election. And I know that's on everyone's minds these days, given we're 4 days away from Election Day. The analysis, to be frank, is pretty easy to do and pretty straightforward. Donald Trump, love him or hate him, has been a promoter of Keystone XL. Fortunately, Keystone has gotten caught up in delays through court rulings in the US, the Supreme Court and the lower courts. There are numerous other lawsuits pending as well. So even if Donald Trump does win, I think it's safe to say the road ahead for Keystone is still somewhat murky. Joe Biden has pledged to withdraw support for the project. Now, Biden is a traditional union supporter, and the truth is he's facing considerable pressure right now from some of his union friends on that position. So I suppose you never really know, but I do think it'd be pretty tricky for him to walk back his position at this time. That being said, demand for oil and gas also depends on a strong global economy. And when you look at that aspect, Donald Trump's divisive and unpredictable approach to international affairs has created significant risk in the global economy. Joe Biden's platform, according to Moody's, would be significantly more beneficial in generating economic growth. And the US economy is not going to recover until they've worked their way through this COVID pandemic. And Trump's erratic lack of leadership on the pandemic has made matters significantly more grim than they really need to be. On another front, and this is one that I don't think people have paid too close of attention to, when Trump lowered the corporate tax rate from 31%, I think it was, down to 21%, it became very close to where Canada's overall corporate tax rate was. And it took away a competitive advantage for Canadian corporations that we'd enjoyed for many years. Biden plans to increase the corporate tax rate, not quite up to 31%, I think around 28%, but that's going to return that competitive advantage for Canadian companies and exporters. And frankly, that'll be, I think, very good for Canada's economy. So in the end, frankly, I worry about the instability and social unrest in the US today and the division that 4 more years of Trump would likely bring about. And perhaps that alone might be the greatest risk, but it's something I'd have to leave the economists to recognize that there are pros and cons to both. So Matthew, I'm going to stop there because I know we're running short on time today, and I look forward to some further discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Brad. It's terrific insight that you just provided. I'm now going to kindly ask all my other panelists to unmute themselves now and to turn on their videos so we can all see your expertly faces. So we're now going to begin the Q&A session. And folks, we're actually joined today by a VIA, a very important attendee. This is Professor Radoslav Dimitrov of Western University. Professor Dimitrov actually helped in the negotiations of the Paris Climate Agreement 5 years ago, pretty much almost to the date. And so, Professor Dimitrov, I'm going to address your question, but first, I'm actually going to try and see if you can ask it yourself, because quite frankly, we'd all like to hear the voice of an expert. If you can, I've now enabled your talking function. I'm just going to wait a little longer to see if you can ask the question.
Hello, can you see me?
Don't know if I can see you just yet, Professor. I'm just
No.
going to zoom
Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear, though.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much for your very, very informative presentations and thoughtful commentary. My question relates to the balance between support for the fossil industry and the diversification of the economy. And my question really is how in your view, support for the oil industry in Canada undermines Canada's economic diversification, long-term prosperity, and competitiveness in a global green economy?
Thank you very much, Professor, and thanks once again for joining us today. Brad, I'm gonna volley that question at you first, and then I'm going to then pass it on to Dinara and henceforth. But one of the things I might add on to that is also in terms of Alberta's economic diversification as well. You could also look at it from a federal as well as a provincial issue. So the floor is yours, Brad.
Well, I think the question is a good one, and it aligns with the traditional Canadian view, in particular of Canadians outside of the oil-producing provinces, that the oil and gas sector is quote a dying industry. Why would we be putting money into that? There's environmental issues involved in it. We should be putting money into other sectors. I think as you look deeper into the oil and gas sector, and I think all the panelists agree, and we're all clean energy supporters at the end of the day. I certainly am, and I have a track record in that area. But I think at the end of the day, there's a huge opportunity for Canada to be a global leader, and I mentioned it during that transition period. In terms of cleaning up as best we can the oil and gas industries here, their production, and making it globally competitive, and then marketing those technologies globally, because the rest of the world is thirsty for that too. But also in the alternatives that will come along that Fernando spoke very eloquently about today. I don't think that it's an all or nothing. I think there's a sweet spot, and I think we're right in it. And I think the federal government's investments in the oil sands are not, as I said before, throwing money at it. I think they're investing strategically in areas that are going to have a very bright future. So that's where I would leave it off. That would be my perspective.
Sure, if I can pick up on that thought, it's a really good question, but I think it's the wrong verb. I don't necessarily think that support for fossil fuel industry will undermine economic diversification and prosperity of Canadians and Canadian economic sectors. I think that, I think the support for fossil fuel energy will actually enhance all of those elements. I think the big question is how does fossil fuel energy pivots itself towards the new energy transformation? And I don't really like the word transition, because energy is always in transition. I mean, we don't have to go that far to sort of think about, excuse me, when, humanity used whale oil, and then we switched to using coal, and then switched to using other petroleum products. So it's a continuous transformation. And I think what I said earlier, the status quo no longer works. The industry needs to push itself. They need to get on the train with the corporate purpose and ESG factoring, and that needs to become a sort of business as usual kind of model. And I think it goes hand in hand with overall economic diversification, because diversification within fossil fuel industry is tremendous. And we saw that probably the most recently, some of the examples Fernando brought up on hydrogen, on lithium extraction, on conversion of natural gas to value-add products like methanol and ammonia. I think it's all happening. We just the industry needs to share that story and not only sort of pave that road in terms of don't come off as elitist, really engage with public, really engage with communities and other industries, because I find that there's a lot of natural synergies between energy and non-energy sectors, where some of the innovation for example, in technology space for medical faculties that could be adopted, for example, in oil and gas, and vice versa, or aerospace. So I think, the industry needs to engage, and I think those will go hand in hand. But, back to Brad's comments, there are challenges in the short term that need to be overcome. Thank you.
Indeed. I'm going to move on to the next, next question. But Professor Dimitrov, thank you very much for that thorough question. Thanks once again for joining us today. I'm going to get a question now coming in from out west, as we have someone named Paige Munro, who I'm quite familiar with. She's a good friend of mine, but she's quite a good scholar herself. And she asked, and this is for you, Fernando, you can answer this one off the bat, and then I'll leave the floor open. What role can LNG have in helping Canada to meet its climate targets?
Well, there's coal to gas conversion, which is always a handy one, but LNG in itself, one of the major things that it can be done in natural gas is a great feedstocks for plastics and a great feedstocks for all these other different items. So LNG can be used as a transition fuel, and we can help it through exports and move to transition a lot of folks that are burning coal already. But again, as I mentioned earlier, we want to sort of maybe look at avoiding technological lock-in, but at the same time, natural gas has a much lower carbon intensity than coal and other sources of power. So we need to really examine where it's strategic and necessary to start using that. Plus, natural gas can be turned quite easily into hydrogen with low emissions.
Matthew, may I chime in? I just want to sort of bring up an additional point on LNG. And I know we look at LNG, Canada looks at LNG as another export opportunity. I think we can't forget about use of LNG for Canadian remote communities that are heavily dependent on highly emissive fossil fuels like diesel or propane. So, you know, bringing in LNG in some sort of form of ISO tanks, I can imagine, for whether that's for electricity generation or domestic needs for, you know, cooking and heating homes and such. I think there's a huge potential to bring in LNG and into those areas and really affect the transition moving forward to sort of minimizing greenhouse gas emissions that come from diesel generation of electricity, for example. Another point about LNG I'd like to make, LNG is still natural gas. Let's not forget that. LNG is just a liquid form of natural gas. So while LNG or gas burns at about half the rate as coal does on electricity generation, we can't forget that there's emissions associated with production of natural gas. We did a study about a year ago that we will show a very critical point that if the fugitive emissions that are coming out with natural gas production go beyond 3% of the overall production capacity of that project, then the benefits of the LNG use and electricity generation actually it's just as bad as coal. So we really have to address the full, what I'm trying to say is it's not only just the downstream, we really need to address the full chain, all the services from the production, from the wellhead, all the way to the burner tip and really minimize that environmental footprint at each step. Thank you.
Absolutely. And just kind of a bit of a similar question, actually, this one coming from Maggie Zhang. Brad, I'm going to address this one towards you and you alone, because I think it's a very kind of politically specific question. So I'm going to actually volley it at the former politician. What more can be done by federal and provincial governments, for example, to push for a carbon neutral nation as a whole in terms of overall carbon neutrality across Canada? And are there also any key areas that we can specifically look into in order to actually take actions immediately?
Well, that's a question I think all panelists would probably like to have a crack at. I think there's a lot of good things being done, and I think that the direction is the right direction. I've long been of the view since my days years ago as energy minister in Ontario that our entire energy systems are in a state of absolute disruption right now. Ontario was one of the first in the world, if not the first, to go completely off of coal. It's not easy. And it took some, I think it took a little bit of short-term pain in terms of energy price costs. So the first challenge is for provincial governments that generally look after energy is to be realistic about the fact that there's a cost to getting off of coal. but there's huge benefits to doing that, health-wise and system-wise, as you build a smarter system. Focusing on smart energy systems, in improving transmission is something it's a traditional approach that works really, really well still. And then just going full out in R&D and more importantly, helping companies not just invent new and emerging technologies, but helping them scale. And that's where we have had challenges, but governments, provincial and federal, all over that now. And they're really trying to help those Canadian companies scale so that they can not just work in the Canadian markets, but work internationally. I could go on forever on this, but there's, I think I'll stop there.
Absolutely. And then Emma, by all means, go ahead. We have not heard from you in a little while.
That's fine. It's an interesting question because, provinces are kind of making this move in some sectors. Of course, you've got the federal government is like, we're going to be, net zero by 2050. Newfoundland and Labrador, which is another oil producing province, they've said the same thing. And they're looking at a lot of offshore wind opportunities and different ways that they can possibly do that. Here in Alberta, that's actually a question that I have put repeatedly to not the federal, the provincial government, like, why, if you want to sell the message to the world, to investors in Europe, to whoever, that the Alberta oil sands are great with ESGs, they're really working on lowering their emissions, which is true. They have some amazing technologies that they've come up with. They've done some great improvements. If you want to sell that message even further and make it seem to have more legs, why, as a province, won't you set a target of, I don't know, net zero by 2050 or something like that? There's no real appetite to do that. It seems to be that if you do want to take that route, you would also have to set realistic targets and ways that you can measure yourself, because the message from governments is, if you just do that, and they love to use this word virtue signaling, I'm sure we've all heard that thrown around, that if you're going to say you're net zero by 2050, you're just saying it, how do we know you're real? But it's like, pick a lane. Are you going to be net zero by 2050? Are you going to sell the message that oil and gas is clean and doing great things? Or are you just going to like, trust us, oil is great and just trust us? Like, you kind of have a pick a lane there. So I'd be interested to see if there are more governments that do take that route, and whether they set realistic targets and ways to measure themselves as well. I think that's really key.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Emma. Dinara, I know you want to chime in on this question, but I
okay. No, I'll let you move on. Just a quick 10 seconds. Yeah, I just want to address while, yes, Emma is right, while provincial government is not taking any stand on specific targets, what we are seeing is the industry, though, moving ahead. Cenovus has released their first ever ESG reporting. Suncor is going to be moving ahead. Like, all the major oil and gas producers are in line with other oil and gas majors around the world. They are understanding the framework, they're understanding the environment, and so I think they're moving in that correct direction.
You
muted.
I was just realized. Moving on to our next question. So Fernando, I'm going to volley this one at you. What are your thoughts on biofuels in terms of renewable diesel to fill the need now for the drop in solutions to stop emissions, instead of waiting for another 15, 20 years or so for green hydrogen to come into play, both in terms of cost and infrastructure? And furthermore, actually, I'm going to allow you to comment a little bit more on the hydrogen economy, because that's something is something that I know you've talked about. But so, in about a minute and a half or so, please explain what comes to your mind.
So biofuels have a great potential to actually lower the carbon intensity of the fuels we use now, but it all depends on the feedstock. And as Dinara said about natural gas, it all depends on where you're starting and how you get there. So there's great potential to use most of the used cooking oil in North America already goes into the production of biofuels, but it's how do we incent the development of these biofuels, which will lower the overall intensity of fuels, and how do we make them a viable market to really incent it? That's where policies like the Clean Fuel Standard at the federal level come into play, and at the provincial level in British Columbia, the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, or in California and Oregon, their low carbon fuel standards. So it's important to bring these new fuels into the mix, and hydrogen is one of those things. if you don't stimulate with policy to lower and mandate that you lower the intensity of fuels, you're not going to get the investment that you need to bring those along.
I saw a cool biofuel thing the other day in Scotland where they're using leftover waste from making whiskey into biofuel. And I just thought that meets like everything you could want: whiskey, biofuel.
That's pretty great. One of the most interesting things, they make something that's chemically identical to regular diesel called HDRD, and from a much grosser input. It's all of the leftover carcasses from slaughterhouses in Oklahoma and Louisiana and Texas go to a facility.
Fernando, whiskey all the way, mate.
I much prefer whiskey.
Well, it's amazing all the new solutions and innovations that come through in regards to actually, to find these types of solutions. It's good to hear these types of things. Another question that came across the radar here, it's actually quite interesting because as many people who are actually in oil or just energy in general, but primarily in oil, there's no sugarcoating it, folks. It can be a bit of an old boys club. And I'm going to actually read the question out loud. In terms of the green transition, it being an opportunity for a push for strong equity overall in terms of employment, federally, provincially, territorially, as well as municipally. Excuse me, I'm just trying to read out loud. What are some frameworks that we could potentially expect coming from within inside government for greater employment equity for people of color, LGBTQ plus individuals, as well as people? I think I said I mentioned people of color and women as well. Is this an opportunity for this to happen? I'm actually going to open this up to actually Emma. Let's hear from you.
Thanks very much, Matthew. It's actually interesting. It's an area that I know a lot of my colleagues have kind of been looking at, this idea that throwing back to how many women are on boards, how many people of color are on boards, like how do you actually make that be a priority? And I don't think that can be driven by governments. I just don't think that can work. I think it's more likely to be driven, and in fact is being driven by a lot of oil companies are making these concerted efforts, or at least saying they're making concerted efforts about employing folks from, Indigenous communities, or employing more women, or employing more people of color. And they're kind of trying to reach out to do that now. I think that potentially it's because of the zeitgeist. I mean, this is part of the discussion. There are pressures that I know the federal government has put on about try and have X amount of women on boards, or X amount of other folks on boards. And that is probably where you start, because when you have diverse hiring practices, then you can have more folks who can they're better represented across the community. But I think it's going to be more industry driven, I think, than government driven. I could be completely wrong there. If anyone disagrees with me, which you probably do, feel free.
I'll chirp in here, Matthew, if that's all right. I don't disagree with you. I think the challenge is it's taking too damn long, and for everyone, but it's not easy. It's not easy. How do you force that change? I think we're seeing more and more, in particular with the diversification of boards, getting more females and diverse board members. It kind of starts at the top, and then the questions start being asked. And I think that's where industry can drive it. And I think governments are watching carefully to see how that board diversification takes place. The other area that I find intriguing and has great prospects is on Indigenous inclusion. In the old days, it would be about writing a check to a community and then going in and doing business in their traditional territory. Today, it's gone beyond that a little bit, a lot. And it's gone to participation, employment, but it's going beyond that even further now to ownership. And I think that's where true partnership takes place, is in ownership. So on the Indigenous side, I would say that's an area where there's lots of room for improvement, but I think we're going to see, I think over the next 5 years, you're going to see a huge sea change in that area.
If I could chime in with a couple of examples, I think I agree with you, Emma. I think the drive would be coming from the private sector mostly. I mean, these are the S and the G, right, in your ESG. And if we can come up with some sort of a framework that we all agree on, then we can easily measure companies against one another. But I just want to go back to the Indigenous participation. I think there's some great examples that we're seeing already with the project reconciliation, for example. This is a 50% ownership of Indigenous communities owing the pipeline. They're right now, that particular project is in negotiations with federal government. The 10% equity stake of Coastal GasLink. This is the gas pipeline that will be bringing natural gas from northeastern corner of British Columbia to the LNG Canada facility. LNG Canada project itself is involving a lot of the local Kitimat community and Indigenous folks, either whether that's in employment opportunities or retraining of the skills, or even women. So there was one program that was launched specifically by LNG Canada where they were offering free training and retraining of the skills for a female population of Kitimat. Thank you.
Okay, well, we are now 1 minute over 3 p.m., but I do want to thank everyone for attending today. But I also do want to thank each and every single one of my panelists. So Emma, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Excellent. Dinara, thank you very much as well.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Fernando, thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, and this is fantastic. I learned a lot today. Thanks.
Brad, thank you, thank you, thank you.
It was great, and it was good to see you again.
Thanks very much, Brad. I really do appreciate it. Okay, folks, so I will conclude this webinar, but before I do want to make a final thank you to all of the members that helped out with this entire webinar at the CIC Toronto branch, especially Sahar Hussein, Daniel Liss, and the CIC Youth Professional Network for and their help in scheduling this event. Joanne Davis, the president of the Canadian International Council's Toronto branch, as well as Anthony Lukwe and Anna Tosic for their constant guidance and tutelage throughout the entire process. I do want to also thank Anna Tosic again, but this time in addition with Kareem Shaheen for their communication support throughout the entire campaign. And then also Tanishta Pramanik for her terrific graphic that she created for the entire event that you guys saw on Twitter and the emails. And Danielle Paroyan for her advice as well throughout the entire campaign. And if I have missed anyone, I do thoroughly apologize, but I'm just gonna also just say thank you just in general to the entire board of the CIC for the support throughout all of this. Okay, folks, that's it. Thanks very much for joining us today. I do apologize that we're about 2 minutes over 3 p.m., but you know, sometimes these discussions go a little bit long because they're very thorough and they're very complex. So thank you very much once again for joining us, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.